Hey, this is Gina Grad.
Hi, this is Teresa Strasser.
Hi, everyone. This is Mike Errico.
Hey there. This is Casey Cavalier.
I'm Rocky Rose.
And you are listening to The Jay Franze Show.
Lucky you.
Welcome to The Jay Franze Show. A behind-the-curtain look at the entertainment industry with insights you can't pay for and stories you've never heard. Now, here's your host, Jay Franze.
Well, hello and welcome to the show. I am Jay Franze, and if you are new here, this is where we take a deep dive into the entertainment industry to provide you with valuable insights and entertaining stories. This week, we get to talk with a producer, an engineer, and a studio owner. We get to talk with Tom Harding. We'll talk to him about how his early years influenced his career in Nashville, what the main differences are between working in Memphis and Nashville, and we'll take a deep dive into his time working with ZZ Top. Now, Tom and I, we've crossed paths several times working in Nashville. We've worked out of the same studios, we've worked with the same musicians, yet we've never met, and I look forward to getting to know him tonight. So if you'd like to join in, comment, or fire off any questions, please head over to jayfranze.com. Now let's get started. Tom, sir, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Jay?
I am fantastic, sir. I'm very excited to talk to you tonight. I'm looking forward to this for some time now.
I have too.
Well, why don't we just kick it off? Can you tell me how your early years have influenced your music career?
Well, once I graduated from college, it was weird. I was working as an intern for Woody Bowles, who went on to manage the Judds and discover the Judds. And I was not planning on being an engineer. And I had done my senior engineering project and played it for Woody's assistant. And she had a fit over it and said, well, you have to meet Gene Eichelberger. Gene Eichelberger at the time was like the god of Nashville. He was the first independent engineer and everything. So I went over there and I met with him and he helped me set up the studio. He was getting ready to record Neil Young and I helped set up for that. And then after about the third day of setup, he turned to me and he says, all right, I want you to go over to Treasure Isle. He says, I want you to tell them I sent you and they're to hire you. I went, well, okay. And so I did it. That when I walked in and said his name, they said, okay, you're hired. I got to work on a lot of projects. The first big project I ever worked on was Larry Willoughby, Rodney Krause. I think it was his cousin, and Rodney was producing and everything. And worked with a lot of artists and learned through a lot of engineers. And then Ed C. started working at Treasure Isle a bunch, and that's who I kind of mentored under and learned a lot from was Ed.
Tell me about that. What was it like working for Ed?
First off, Ed was the first engineer I ever saw bring gear into the studio. Nowadays it's common. Your cartage guy has to show up and bring all your cases in. But Ed was the first one. He came carrying this black box under his arm. And I'm like, what is that? And he goes, well, that's my EQ rack. He likes Sphere consoles. So he had some guy rack up a bunch of Sphere mic pre's and EQs. And he had an API stuck in there. When I started, everybody was like, oh, don't use a lot of EQ. Don't use EQ. And I watched Ed, and he's like plugging 2 EQs in and cranking it. And these drums are sounding like freaking amazing. And I'm like, oh, my God. And then the funniest thing happened. Massenburg came about and started building the GML EQs. Ed was like the second or third guy in the country to order GML. And I remember him making me chase down the UPS truck because he wanted to try it out so bad. So he had me chasing UPS so that we could try out the GML. And then, of course, Ed's kind of the one that gave me the start because I was assisting him a lot. And I remember we were doing one of Ricky Skaggs' records, and Paul had called Ed to do something else. And so he said, well, it's your time. And he put me in there and had me start doing all the overdubs for him. And that's kind of how I transitioned in, so to speak.
Well, talk about that for a second. You get that call, so it's your first time taking the chair. Were you nervous?
Oh my God, was I nervous? I called Ricky up the night before, and I said, I don't think I can do this. I'm sick. And Sharon, his wife, got on the phone. And she goes, Ricky said you'd do this. Now you need to go in there and do it. So I showed up the next morning, and it was so funny because we worked for about a week, and we were doing Ricky's record and Dolly's record at the same time. And I'm overdubbing both these records. And one day we're doing an overdub, and I'd gotten comfortable, and I was doing okay. And then Ed was off, and he came walking in, and then it was like it all started over again. I had sweat running down and everything.
Of course.
And when Ed left, Ricky made me stop. He just sat there and laughed for about 10 minutes. He goes, didn't know what to do when Daddy came in the room, did you?
Right.
No. The only thing that was weird in my career is I was doing all, I was kind of was the rock guy in Nashville, and I'd be doing Ricky Skaggs Monday through Friday, and then I'd be in the studio with some metal band, Triple X or Intruder or somebody like that on the weekends. So that was always kind of a thing with the head.
Being from Boston, I was always recording rock bands and metal bands. And then when I moved to Nashville, I wanted to take that aggression and add it to country music. And I had a hard time working with people and trying to have that little bit of an edge to it. And now it seems like it's common practice. So,
yeah, that's common practice.
But that's all right.
I can remember some clients calling me up and saying, we heard you do this. A Christian act would call up and say, we heard you're like the rock guy. Can you send us a sample? Because we're really, really edgy. And I go, well, how edgy are you? And I'd say, so I'd send them something, and they'd call, oh, we're not that edgy.
We're not that edgy. No, that's too funny.
It's pretty funny.
What was some of your more favorable metal or heavy projects?
Well, I guess my most favorite would have to be Intruder, because they had the most success. I did that. I did a record. I don't know if you remember a band called Will and the Bushmen. They were on SBK Capitol. I was really proud of that record. It was weird how we got hooked up. Sam Ramage at EMI, they needed to run into the studio and do a thing for Rock and Roll High School 2. So we went in and we cut a song, and we all got along great. And so when it came time to do the album, the band wanted to work with me. And on a side note, the weird thing about Rock and Roll High School 2 is we got it finished. Everybody was excited. The record label was excited. The movie studio was excited. And then whichever Corey it was in that movie, I can't remember if it was Corey Haim or which one, they got arrested for heroin possession, and they canned the movie. So that never saw the light of day. That's a record called The Blunderbuss that I really, really, really like. And that was a great band. And through that, I obtained a manager. I got Jody Stevens. Are you familiar with him from Memphis? He was in Big Star. He was the drummer for Big Star. And then he worked for Arden and had a management company. And they managed me, and that's how I was able to do like the B.B. King record and some other things. I did the Sonny Landreth record.
So is that more of the blues stuff when you were doing Buddy Guy and things like that?
Yeah, well, the Buddy Guy thing came. I did this B.B. King record, which is a really cool record. B.B. came up with this concept that he wanted to do a blues record with all the blues artists that hadn't really gotten the recognition that he thought they deserved. And so he did all these duets, and Buddy Guy was one of them. And I have a funny story about Albert King. So Albert King came into play, and he shows up with his old Telecaster, and he needs an amp. And so they bring in a Princeton or something, I forget, whatever the Fender is with 4 speakers, I forget which one that is. And he goes and gets his guitar and he breaks a string, and he bums an E string off of somebody. He puts on one new E string and leaves all the rest grungy as they are. Then he goes across the amp and he kicks every knob and goes, it looks like, that movie where it goes to 11.
Turn it to 11.
Except he turns the bass all the way off. So we get ready to start. He hits the first chord on the guitar and blows the amp up. And so And it was go find another amp. But just funny story, just lots of fun things on that record. That was this record where be a different artist every one in the morning and one in the evening. Two of the artists were so old school that we had to pay them cash in a paper bag because they didn't trust the man. So yeah, just great record all around.
Well, while you're talking about that, what's the main difference you saw between Nashville and Memphis?
Well, I'll tell you the main difference. In Memphis, nothing moves fast and nothing's nearly as organized as it is here. But on the other end, like when I was working with ZZ Top, we would spend all day getting a guitar sound and we'd spend 15 minutes doing a vocal. And in Nashville, it's kind of the opposite. You know, the session guy sets up, you record, you get the guitar and it's done. And you spend 3 weeks on the lead vocal. So in my experience, when I did all these different rock, and the same with the blues records, on the BB record, all the vocals were live. We had everybody in a room and he's just the mic sitting up there facing the drummer. He's just looking at the drummer with the dead side of the mic. And those were all the keeper vocals. We didn't fix anything.
Really? So he recorded it down live with the band.
It all went down live. Oddly enough, the only thing we fixed were the horns. We fixed some of the horns. They were in a booth. Everybody else was live and going down live.
But even the horns played live.
The horns played live, and we didn't replace them on everything, but we did fix the horns a little bit. But we didn't fix anybody else.
Well, that's pretty impressive.
And BB's a funny guy because he doesn't call anybody by name. So Mr. Drummer, I was Mr. Engineer, and everybody's Mr. whatever their job is.
Makes it much easier to remember everybody.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, great guy.
Tonight, you're Mr. Guest.
Mr. Guest, okay.
That's pretty cool. So, I mean, that is a very big difference between Nashville and Memphis. And like you're saying, in Nashville, where the session musicians come in, you know, it takes all night long to set up for the musicians, but they play their parts down in 5-10 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
So that's pretty cool. But then, like you were saying, when you bring in the singers, they take a lot longer time to go ahead and record them and get it right.
Now, I did a couple records in Canada. Now, that's really weird.
Really? What's different there?
Well, if you have a 10 o'clock call in Nashville, that means you're gonna hit red at 10 o'clock. In Canada, 10 o'clock means they show up at 10 o'clock for breakfast. And you might be able to, you might hit red by 1 o'clock if you're lucky.
So what was the rest of the day like in Canada?
Slow. It was all real loosey-goosey. I will say it was a beautiful studio. Both studios I worked in looked out over lakes. One looked out over Lake Ontario. That part was great. And the musicians were great. It's super, super relaxed. And at least with these particular guys, they weren't used to saying, okay, let's do that again. I think we can get that a little better. And they weren't used to, you know, let's save a take and see if we can beat it kind of thing.
Right.
But that may have been the particular band I was working with or something.
What band was it?
It was a girl I was producing called Stephanie Beaumont, and it was her band. We'd cut one album in Nashville with her and used session musicians, and then she decided she wanted to stay in Canada because Canada has all those rules where you complete the four parts of the maple leaf and you get extra money and everything.
Right.
But she wanted to get all 4 maple leaves.
Government money.
Yes.
Yeah, I've done a few projects for artists in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
But you mentioned in passing ZZ Top. Where did you record them?
So the ZZ Top connection is kind of weird. So I worked with a group named Kennedy Rose. It was 2 lady songwriters from here, and they got signed to Sting's label, and I co-produced their album with them. And a lot of their stuff was programmed with Fairlight. And Carl Marsh was the Fairlight programmer. You probably worked with Carl in the past. So when we got done with that, Carl had been programming with Billy Gibbons. And the first time I worked with him is I get a call And Carl says, can you come to, and I forget what studio, 615 or something. Can you come and do guitars on this thing for ZZ Top? And I'm like, well, yeah, sure. And I showed up, and it was the song that ended up being on the greatest hits, that Elvis song, Viva Las Vegas. And Billy had made a little sequence on some little sequencer and then had Dusty sing to it. And they had dumped that into the Fairlight, and Carl had created a new drum track to it. And Carl had told him I got great guitar sound, so I went over there. And Billy's thing is he doesn't like amps. So we were using some direct thing, and we did all the guitars, and then the girls came in and we did backgrounds. We did it all in one day. And that was it. I didn't hear from them. And then about 6 months later, Billy calls and says, how quick can you get to the airport? I go, why? He goes, why don't you fly to Houston? We're doing a record. I need you to get guitar sounds for me. So we did that for several months. Either he would come here or I'd come there. And then in the middle of it, he had produced, I don't even remember the guy. It was some luthier that did a record that Billy produced, and I mixed that in his studio in Houston.
What was his studio like?
It was fairly bare bones. He had a Mitsubishi console, which was, I think, the same thing Kiva had in their B room, and he had just copied what Kiva had in their B room. The one thing about Billy Gibbons that's amazing, I remember going down there, we're trying to get a guitar sound, and like I said, he doesn't like amps, so we're plugging into this. I think we had a Parker, a Sans amp, and all, and we kept saying none of us liked it. And then he had a Marshall JMP1, and then we started pushing buttons and everything and playing it. And Billy, it doesn't matter what guitar it is, he plugs it in. It's Billy Gibbons, and he plugged in. And we started dialing the sound. And I'd worked with Terry Manning, who'd done Eliminator before as an assistant. And we both go, that's it. And I said, Billy, that sounds just like the guitar on Legs. To me, this is a career moment. Billy Gibbons starts singing and playing Legs to me, just him and me in the studio. And I'm like, wow, this is kind of surreal. And so awesome. That's the album that ended up becoming Antenna. And I think I worked on about 4 or 5 of those songs, and then Joe Hardy finished it.
Well, I can't imagine you go in with an artist like that and not use an amp.
Yeah, now I know Terry told me that Eliminator, they used a Legend amp, is what they used. And that was the last album I think he used an amp on. And he may now have started using amps again, but he went through a period where he didn't like using amps. And the one album that Joe did before that, made everybody sound like the Boston Guitar.
Tom Schultz
Rockman
was a Rockman, yes, sir.
Rockman. They had a big endorsement on that, on one of those things, so they used it on that.
I don't know if you ever heard this story that Tom Schultz, when he played live, he could tell what battery was in his Rockman.
Oh, wow.
You think, no, there's no possible way, but I mean, he created that. I mean, he went to MIT. I mean, the guy is very, very smart. It wouldn't surprise me if he was actually capable of hearing some little nuance that most people don't pick up.
I produced this band, what were they called? Disturbance, for RCA, and we were at Ardent, and we had worked, and we had spent the day getting the guitar sound, and we had done guitars all week, and we took Sunday off, and Ardent asked if they could come and mix a jingle in the studio, and they would document everything and blah, 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 and supposedly not touch anything, which is, you never should believe. And we came back that Monday and we plugged the guitars in, and they just sounded terrible. It was just awful. And we kept checking, and we checked all the EQ, we checked everything. We checked this, we checked that, and everything checked out. The mics were still in place and everything. And I said, well, are the chords the same from going to that amp to that amp? I guess what we did is we swapped heads to the different cabinets, and it was like, boom, a whole different world. So
went right back to the way it was.
Any little thing. Oh, And everybody always says it's a chord anyways. There's
Well,
a
it's the
problem.
easiest thing
It's
to
always
blame
a chord.
something on.
Yeah,
Right.
it's always the chord.
Well, when you mention something like that, your time working in Houston with him and everything, what was the biggest takeaway? What was the lesson you learned from that time?
Well, really the biggest thing is that great guitar players, it's not the guitar, it's not the amp, it's their fingers. No matter what guitar we plugged in, it was going to sound like Billy Gibbons.
Yeah, that sound comes from him.
Is the way it is. And kind of going back to that, when I was doing the B.B. King record, Leon came in first, the rhythm guitar player, and he sets all Billy's stuff up for him and everything. And so he plugs in and he says, I'll get BB's signal up for you and everything. And I said, oh, are we going to get Lucille out? And he just laughs and he goes, there's no such thing as Lucille. And it was just, he had about 20 Lucilles.
Right.
Yeah. It's
That's
still all in the fingers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've seen some musicians pick up toy instruments and make them sound great. So, I mean,
I know.
It's truly, even engineers like yourself, you put yourself in front of a Mitsubishi console compared to something else, you still get a way of making it sound great. So I think it's definitely the person.
Right.
Now, you worked with an artist who was always one of my favorites, but I don't think got the recognition they should have. Can you tell me what it was like working with Kevin Sharp?
Kevin was, this is so funny because I just discussed Kevin Sharp with somebody that's probably listening to this right now. Kevin, if you know the story, Kevin got sick with cancer and
Yes.
he made the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And David Foster heard about that. And so David went to Kevin and signed Kevin to his record label, 143. So I never understood why, but David didn't want to produce Kevin. And so Chris Farron produced him, who would also produce the Dina Carter record that I worked on. But Kevin was really introverted and really shy. The only thing Kevin loved was he loved to sing and he loved to perform. And unfortunately, Kevin was sick most of the time. In fact, during the second record, he was pretty sick. But I'll tell you an amazing thing about Kevin Sharp that nobody knows. He really gave back. So after the first record, between the first and the second, a little girl came to Make-A-Wish, and she wanted to do a duet with a country artist. And who do you think stepped up to the plate and did the duet with her but Kevin Sharp?
Kevin Sharp.
Yeah. So I think that's a pretty amazing thing myself.
He was truly awesome. I really like Kevin.
That went gold. What was the song Nobody Knows was the big hit, I think?
Yeah.
And that had already been cut as a pop hit.
Yes.
And Chris wrote that. And then on that particular song, there's tons of background vocals, and they're all Chris Farron. He sang every background vocal on that. It's like 12 tracks.
No, it was a great album.
Yeah, it's a great album.
How many did he end up putting out?
He did two. And part of that was he was sick, but also he was on, I think it was Asylum, and Asylum dissolved shortly after the second record came out. In fact, between the first record and the second record, they had a big regime change. And I don't think everybody else at the regime liked Kevin as well as Kyle and the earlier people did. But that happens.
Did you own your own studio for a little while, didn't you?
I did. I owned Tombstone Recording. It started out. So I had a partner, Curtis Stone, and he came up with the idea of Tombstone. He said, we'll take your first name and my last name. Chris used to always call me Tom B. Stone because he couldn't understand the Tombstone part. So, he always called me Tom B. But so we were on 17th for about 2 years. Then I kept the name Tombstone, but I moved to Berry Hill and bought a building there. We were there for about 15 years. Did a lot of fun projects there, a lot of records there.
Well, tell me what it was like being a studio owner.
Oh, it's horrible. Nobody wants to be a studio owner. I mean, things like that you don't think about. Like, I remember the computer went out on our console, and when the computer goes out on a digitally controlled console, that means the console doesn't work. And we're just watching client after client, ching, 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 the money go away. And I was booking other studios for more money and covering the bill so that, you know, we could keep going. So I'd go to Soundstage. We were charging $400 a day, and Soundstage would be $700 a day. And I would pay the $700 and only bill my client $400 because I didn't want to get it. But, you know, that's probably your biggest thing is your maintenance things. And way back when we had analog machines, you know, you would get your heads relabbed, get the tape, do this, do that. And unfortunately, when I had the studios, when we kept transitioning, and one thing you have to say about Nashville, it's always ahead of the curve. You know, everybody was way more digital in Nashville than LA. And I remember, so we were analog 24 track, and the bigger studios, of course, were 32 track digital, but the smaller demo studios were still 24 track analog. And then, do you remember Radar? The Atari Radars?
Yeah.
So Radar came out, and then we all had to switch to Radar, and that lasted for about 3 years. And then it was Pro Tools. And I remember the Radar cost me like 20 grand. And then the first Pro Tools system cost like 15 or 20 grand. You know, now a Pro Tools system isn't that much, but back then it cost about 20 grand. And it was like, wow, is there anything else we need to buy?
Every couple of years, you're spending 20 grand.
Every studio owner will tell you, you know, headphones, things like that, they break, and constantly either replacing or buying mic cables. So, and a studio is kind of a weird thing because clients, and especially session musicians, they can be so critical even about the coffee. You know, if the coffee isn't good, you'll get a bad reputation. And I remember this story. We had an intern come in, and we're telling him, okay, this is what we do. This is what we do. We said, we're really noted for having really good coffee. You got to come in the morning. You get the bean out, you grind it, you put this many scoops in, blah, 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 blah. Oh, okay. We're not 30 minutes into the session, and musician comes over to me and goes, I don't mean to complain, but this coffee sucks. And so my assistant had to leave and go make fresh coffee, and then he had to pull the intern aside. And so he's telling him, you know, hey, it's a serious thing. The coffee's a serious thing. And, you know, that's the problem with interns. They never believe if you tell them it's serious, it's really serious. Every little thing is serious.
I know that two of us have worked in the world of education for a period of time.
Oh, yeah.
And I think when you try to get that point across, it's not just coffee, it's mindset, it's self-awareness when you're in a studio of when to talk, when not to talk, you know, when to jump in and help and when to step aside. So do you think that from that point of view, education and time spent in school matters?
I'm gonna say something I didn't think I'd ever say. I used to be very pro education, and now I'm not as pro education because I don't know how to say this nicely, but at least 90% of the schools, 80% of the faculty have never really been in a studio and done anything. And I take this because my son went to a very prominent art school for film, and it was the same thing. The teachers were telling him things that really didn't make sense because they'd never really done anything in the industry. And I think it's more important where the internship, if you get in the right place, the internship is the most important thing. And I always told people, in school, you learn the basics, and then in my case, I had a minor in business, so that did help, like you say, when it came to running the studio. And when I sent my son to school, I said, you know, you're not going there to change your art, you're going there to learn the mechanics. But of course, the first thing they want to do is tell them that they don't know the slightest thing, and they need to be doing it this way instead of that way.
Well, sure. I think one of the things I learned from being in the education field for that period of time was that they were teaching the basics and they were trying to teach a broad brushstroke of the basics. So that way
Yes.
you learned a little bit about each thing and you could pick a direction you'd want to go in. But ultimately, it still came down to what you did outside of the school that mattered and what you learned. And that's where you actually gained your experience from. But like you're saying, as far as education goes, there's nothing in our industry that you couldn't learn on your own.
No.
I think school just accelerates that if you have the right mindset. If you're a student that goes in
Exactly.
and puts your nose down and learns the most you can while you're in school, gets an internship, goes to work for somebody and shadows somebody, I think those are the things that make somebody learn. But if you're just trying to get a passing grade, don't even bother.
Right. You can do a portfolio and pass with a D, but that doesn't mean you have a portfolio that's going to get you a job, but it means you pass the class.
Right.
I'm not nearly as pro education as I used to be.
Yeah, I got jaded from being in it and seeing what was actually happening behind the scenes. As much as I enjoyed helping the students and trying to give advice and work through some challenges that they may have had, but then you get trying to keep federal aid and things like that, and you have to maintain a certain grade point average.
Title whatever, 9 or whatever it's called, Title 4.
Right.
Yeah.
So therefore you have to, let's make sure that these people get through the program. And some people didn't deserve to get through the program. So it was one of those dilemmas.
Yeah.
But that's all right. Again, let's go back to the studio. So you owned that studio for quite some time. What made you close it down?
Well, I started teaching a lot more, and then I'd kind of closed it down, and then something happened in my life that was pretty life-changing and traumatic. So my son and I sold the building off and everything, and all the businesses in there.
Well, that's too bad.
It was time for a change.
No, I can understand that. Was there anything you took away from it?
One thing I learned, this is kind of a skill I developed, is being able to, if you've done a lot of demos, there's always like 14,000 people in the control room, and you have to learn to be able to listen to what's coming through the speakers and totally block out everything that's going on behind you. And we used to do demos 5 days a week, and it was always that. Somehow I got good at being able to listen to just the one person I needed to and block out everything else.
Well, the demo process is pretty unique, especially unique to Nashville. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. So first off, understand what a demo is. If a songwriter writes a song, we'll just use Tim McGraw for an example. So you've come in and you want to pitch this song to Tim McGraw. Well, you may have just sat in front of your laptop with an acoustic guitar and sang a vocal and acoustic. Well, you can't send that to an artist. They want to hear what it's going to sound like as a record. So what happens is they come in, they book a band, which is usually drums, bass, acoustic, electric, keys, and sometimes a utility. You might have a steel or a fiddle on there, but you'll definitely have the 5. And they'll play this guitar vocal, and the musicians will all listen to it. And usually somebody has written a chord chart out the night before. So the musicians will have the chord chart in front of them, and they'll listen to it. And if the songwriter has anything special, there might be a lick that's in the intro or something. He'll make sure he teaches that to the guitar player. And then the guys will walk out there, and within about 15 minutes, they've played that song down. It sounds like a record, and they're done, and they're ready for the next one. A session in Nashville is 3 hours, and they'll usually get 4, sometimes 5 songs in a session completely done except for lead vocals and background vocals. And then they'll come in, they'll do the lead vocal. In other words, the band will lead. What we used to do is we would track, take a lunch break, tell the intern, tear the studio down and set up a vocal mic, come back at 2 o'clock, do vocals till like 10 o'clock at night, and then come back the next day and mix it all. And we'd mix 5 songs in a day.
That's insane.
And we do that 4 or 5 days a week. It gets you good at getting good drum sounds and getting things fast, though.
I always say working in Nashville is all about speed.
It's all about speed. It's all about speed.
So can you tell us a little bit more about how the union comes into play with all of this?
So in Nashville, you have the musicians union, and everything is in 3-hour blocks, 10 to 6, 10. And the 10 p.m. is an overtime session. So if you're a musician doing a demo, you're on there for 3 hours, you get paid approximately $200 for 3 hours. If you're doing what they call a master, in other words, a record, it's about $300 for a 3-hour session. If you're on a strict union session, if you go 5 minutes over, you got to pay overtime. If you work on Saturdays, you got to pay. So all your times are dictated by the union. That's why I say we start at 10 o'clock, because that's when the union says you're supposed to start. And it's changed a little bit. We've gotten to where we use catering now a lot. So you might not start till 12 o'clock, and then you'll take a break at 5. But instead of everybody leaving, they'll eat there. And that way it keeps a more cohesiveness, and everybody doesn't feel like they're having to push it so much. They'll still only work 6 hours.
Well, that's actually a really good idea.
Because they've decided, if you cater, you're going to get started back on time. If everybody goes out, then with Nashville traffic and everything, you might not start. You end up losing more money than the cost of catering in the meal.
Right. That's what I was just going to say, is if you think about it, catering is probably less expensive than the time you would have spent paying for them to be out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One guy's 15 minutes late. If it's the drummer or the bass player, you're not going to do anything. And then you're going to pay everybody else 15 minutes of overtime on the back end.
Right. And I mean, that adds up between the musician's time, the assistant, the engineer, if there is a producer in the room, the studio. I mean, it adds up pretty quick.
It's funny, when I used to teach and the students were late, I used to always say, okay, let me give you an example. This is a string session that you're on, and you've got 30 string players out there waiting for you to engineer, and you're 15 minutes late. I said, now each one of those people is going to get an extra $50. That's on you. That's $1,500 plus the studio time you just wasted trying to get them there, understanding why it was so important to be on time.
Well, that brings up another point. There's so many variables when it comes to it, and there's so many people involved. Even right down, we mentioned the musicians, each individual musician. We mentioned the producer, the engineers, the assistants, the studios. But then there's also the record labels and the production companies and the publishing companies and so on.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of money changing hands at all times. I mean, how do you feel about the politics that play into all of that?
I hate politics of all kinds. And the one bad thing, a lot of publishers, and it really got bad in Nashville. The publishers all kept complaining that the studios were charging too much. And yet I'd be doing a session, and every person on the session would use cartage, and the cartage bills added up more than what I was charging to engineer and for the studio and for engineering fees. And they all decided, we're going to get Pro Tools and do it on our own. And it was never the songwriter or the artist's fault for being on budget. I remember, I tell this story all the time. I had a writer that worked for a publishing company. He did 8 songs, and then we would mix these songs, and it would take forever to mix. And the publisher comes over to my studio and he goes, why is this taking so long? And why are you spending so much money? And I said, well, your artist wants 8 versions of each song. And the song is 4 minutes long, just in print time. That's 36 minutes just to print it. That's not counting mixing it. But they could never understand. They just still insisted I was gouging them. That it was my fault. And this guy he'd want just vocal, just guitars, just drums, track up, vocal down, all these different mixes.
TV version, instrumental version.
TV version, instrumental version, you name it. He wanted a version of it.
Of course, yeah. Now, you mentioned the publishing companies, we'll just get a Pro Tools rig and do it ourselves. And they do that, and they still do that to this day.
Oh, yeah.
But they're missing out on a few key points in that equation, at least in my opinion. You know, you have the room. The room was built for a reason because it has a certain characteristic to that room. And when you put a drum kit in there, it makes that drum kit sound alive. And it takes somebody like yourself to sit behind a console and not only be able to push the buttons, but to know why you're pushing the buttons. And it is an art. So, yes, it's engineering and it's technical, but it's also an art and it's very creative.
I'll give you an example. I got called on something. Their vocals didn't sound good. Can I come over and help them? And they said, we have the best mic, we have the best preamp, we have the best compressor. And I said, okay, what do you got? So they had one of those Sony 8000s with the heat shield on it and everything. And they were going into a V72, and then that was going into an LA2A. And like, yeah, that all sounds good, except you got tube after tube after tube. And I said, you're just getting a wall of tube distortion. They couldn't figure out what I meant. And I said, well, throw an 87 up and let's see if it sounds any better. And of course, they threw an 87 up and it was a way less distorted just because the fuzz was gone. But They don't understand all that. They think, you know, plug a mic in. And in fact, they'd be better off just using an SM7 like you have with no compression and a decent preamp. But they all want to become engineers. I get mad all the time. I say, too many people think they own a laptop and they're an engineer or they're a movie director or something because they can do something on their laptop.
Well, that was part of my issues that I had with the school is we would issue everybody a laptop and a M-Box and little Pro Tools rig, and they go home and they think they're engineers, and it's really not. It takes years of studying under somebody and understanding what all of these pieces of equipment are. Like you just mentioned the tubes or the Sony mic with that radiator at the back of it and when to use it, when not to use it. I mean, so there's definitely things that are value you get from going through the school and then studying under somebody. And I can't stress that enough. Studying under somebody is key. So let's talk real quick. Can you tell me what it was like working with Olivia Newton-John?
My time with Olivia was only one day. Now, I tell a funny story, and I don't know if I should, but I'll never forget this. So I think we were actually working on Kevin in Soundstage in the little room up front. And Chris was producing Olivia, and they were going to track, Ed was going to track with them the next morning, and then I was going to do, the only thing I think I did on that was a choir overdub, but Olivia had to come in and double check the keys. It was so funny. She comes in and we're just sitting down to eat, and she was hungry, so we all kind of gave her some of our steak out. And it's so funny. Thomas, the assistant, was flipping channels to see what was going on. It was clear back then when they had that box, that Comcast box. And she goes, "Oh, stop. Let's go back. And Thomas goes, okay. And he starts flipping back. She goes, I haven't seen this movie in forever. And it was Xanadu that she was in. And I just thought that was kind of weird that she wanted to watch her own movie.
Watch her own movie?
Yeah, yeah. But you know what? When we did the choir, I don't even think she was there. I think she'd cut the tracks and gone home and just trusted Chris to do everything else.
Well, that's what I was kind of wondering, just how much involvement she had.
She, it was weird. All these iconic artists, like I did a song for John Denver, and he was the same way. I thought, he was always, when he did the CMA Awards and everything, he was Mr. Dynamic. He was so quiet, introverted in the studio. And Gus Harden was playing keys and everything went through Gus. And John was afraid to talk to anybody, make any kind of decision or anything. It was crazy. All the iconic artists, Charlie Pride was the same way. They just all those 70s guys, I guess they were told they couldn't speak in the studio or something.
I could see that. I mean, they come across as that type of personality and trusting, and I don't know,
Yeah.
like John Denver or Olivia Newton-John, I don't know how much involvement they'd really want to have. I think they enjoy performing more than they enjoy recording.
Right. And they really know how to turn it on for the stage. They definitely, whereas today's artists' personalities aren't that much different. I think theirs was more two different personalities. Stage and studio, I guess.
All right, sir. Well, we have this thing here we call Unsung Heroes, where we take a minute to shine a little light on somebody who doesn't typically get some recognition. It can be an assistant. It can be somebody behind the scenes. It can be a family member. Do you have anybody you'd like to shine a little light on?
Well, yeah. There's my production partner, T.W. Hale. We've been friends forever. I mean, I always tell the story. And we've known each other. I always make a joke. He was changing Cameron, my son's diapers in the studio way back when, and his daughter and everything. But I told you something happened in 2015, and I'd basically given up and quit engineering. And then T-Dub says, "Oh, do you have anything at home you can mix with?" I don't want to. Oh, he goes, "I just did these demos and I just really, really need you to do them. Nobody can mix it like you can." And so I got the computer out of the closet and everything, and I set it up, and I mixed his demos, and then Dennis Ledbetter called, and we went in and did a record with him. And TW just kind of kept pushing me till finally I put a real studio in the basement and everything, and he got me back into engineering, because by 2015, I didn't think I would ever do it again. And then thanks to TW, I'm back.
Now, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Tom is not only an amazing engineer, but he's an amazing producer. So please join me in giving him a big thanks for taking the time to share his stories with us. And thank you for taking the time to hang with me here. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can do that and find the links to everything mentioned over at jfranze.com/episode 30. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening to The Jay Franze Show. Make sure you visit us at jfranze.com. Follow, connect, and say hello. This episode has been brought to you by VR Knives, your source for 100% custom knives made by a true rock star. So, if you're in the market for a new piece of art, reach out to VR Knives. 407-421-5528. 407-421-5528.